All right, so we are youth. As we are often reminded, we are the future. But as youth, what is our relationship with the future? What does our future look like? In short, we don't have one. We don't have a future. To quote the greatest futurist of our time, William Gibson, we don't have a future because the present is too volatile. But what am I talking about? Of course we have a future. The future is tomorrow, next week, 10 minutes from now. That's not the same future. I'm talking more the capital F future, as in the atomic age of the 1950s, than an iPhone without a headphone jack as the future. You see, in the 1950s, there was a distinct idea of what the future would look like, and a plan to make such a dream real. There was an idea of a fission bomb and a fission reactor. With a fusion bomb and a fusion reactor, what would the world of widespread, highly efficient energy look like? The government, artists, filmmakers, advertisers of the age decided that it would look like this. It would be a pastel-colored, smooth-lined, atomic-inspired glory. This, if you've ever seen an episode of The Jetsons, you know exactly what this future looks like. In this era, this literally was the future. And it was leaking into the world in film, in television shows, in books, of course, because that's where fiction exists. But it was becoming real when it was entering car design, was visible on the wallpapers of office buildings, or in architecture, in the most permanent of public art. This was a dream, and it was becoming real because people were making it real. Unfortunately, the atomic future was blindsided by subsequent history, by the Cold War. As the 1960s approached, or rather its end approached, atomic no longer meant clean, cheap, accessible energy, but meant bomb, ready to annihilate you and everyone you know. The atomic was no longer the future, but the looming threat of the end. It left a space that was to be filled by something new, by the age of the computer. The first home computers were kits, much like this one, the MITS Altair 8800. It was bought and built mostly by computer enthusiasts and was not at all popular. The first accessible computer that was widespread was the Apple II. It was connected to a pseudo-internet, as in you could have very, very minimal connection, and it changed the way that people understood media. Yes, sure, computers themselves were nothing new at this point. It was public knowledge that the government had been using computers on closed networks for security reasons for years. They were just never publicly accessible. Much like the futurists of the 1950s, there were people who imagined what the world of the widespread computer looked like. It was almost a response to the optimism of the nuclear age. It was a much more dismal future. It was a world of a neon haze illuminating an endless urban sprawl. This aesthetic was pioneered by Ridley Scott in his 1982 film Blade Runner, and the themes of the cyberpunk in protest with the past was established in Neuromancer, Gibson's first novel. Both of these pieces had themes of artificial intelligence, of high tech, and of an extremely large wealth gap by extreme corporate control. A lot of the notability of Neuromancer especially comes from its idea of cyberspace, the concept of a space accessible to anyone that houses any information that could be desired if you knew how to get your hands on it. A year after this book, Gibson defines cyberspace himself as a consensual hallucination experienced daily by billions of legitimate operators in every nation. Later that year in 1985, America Online went live. People began to connect with others on opposite sides of a continent of the US. 4 years later, the World Wide Web launched. And people began to think, maybe this is what this dream of cyberspace feels like and looks like. Information began to travel around the world at the speed of light. Earlier in that same year, 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. The Berlin Wall marked the end of the Cold War. It guaranteed NATO's victory over the Soviet Union. Yes, sure, MAD had been in place for a couple of years, so nobody was under any real threat of nuclear annihilation anymore, but it was still the end of the longest war in the history of the US, 40 years long or some. Later that year, in the summer of 1989, the American political scientist Francis Fukuyama published his famous essay, The End of History. He treats the Cold War in this essay as it was, as an ideological conflict between the Western world with Western liberalism and democracy against an updated Marxism of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact nations. He called the Western world's victory over the Soviet Union the total exhaustion of viable systematic alternatives to Western liberalism. To Fukuyama, the victory of democracy in the Cold War made it the end of mankind's ideological evolution. It was going to be the final form of human government. The only thing that would ever happen past this was the transportation and the exportation of consumerism and democracy and capitalism. There was nothing more. This would create a universal, homogeneous state defined by the availability of stereos and VCRs. What this really meant is it would be a capitalist, consumer-based economy ran by a democratic government. Think similar to what the US did to feudal Japan after it essentially bombed the country flat in the Second World War. It took a feudal nation that wasn't in the best economic state and turned it into a manufacturing powerhouse in under 15 years. In the 90s and the late 80s, the US was at a kind of peacetime. There were no real wars that had any lasting effect on its culture or its economy or its politics, especially as they were in the shadow of the looming future in the year 2000. In his 1997 articles, The End of the Millennium or The Countdown End, in the Shadow of the Millennium, which very well might be the same article, just translated by two different people, he said that we are straining the past events through the filter of memory, not to give them meaning, which they have lost in the course of time, but to launder them, to see them for all of their beauty and none of their pain, to see the past as a nostalgic dream. To Baudrillard, the past was always with us at this point. It was following us around as an artificial double of itself, frozen in a sham exactitude in film, in television, in media, whether it is a new film, 1995, that was remembering the good old days, or it was an old piece of media that you could remember its first viewing. This was mostly aided by the increase of accessibility of the prosthetic memory. The VCR, the cassette tape, the CD, the DVD. You no longer had to wait for ABC to air an episode of your favorite television show anymore. If you wanted to watch an episode of Seinfeld, you just had to buy season 4 on VCR. If a show was finished, it wasn't gone anymore. It was incredibly easy to relive the past, so people stopped worrying about the future. It wasn't in any risk. It was being sold to you every commercial break. Despite all of its anticipation, the arrival of the year 2000 was a non-event. There was no change. The 21st century didn't really start culturally until September 11th, 2001. Gibson called, in his 2003 best-selling novel, Pattern Recognition, he called 9/11 an experience outside of culture. It was the point where the Western world realized that it had enemies that couldn't be deterred from taking action by flying a squadron of fighter jets, carrying a nuclear payload into enemy airspace, or by sending a Navy armada near the territorial waters of an opposing force. This was an enemy that could strike anywhere at any time without notice, and there was no infrastructure to stop it. People were terrified. They were scared to enter tall buildings or fly, because they were fairly reasonably worried that they wouldn't come out. After 20 years or so of making a hell of a lot of money predicting the future, Gibson said that we didn't have one anymore. We have no idea now of who or what the inhabitants of our future might be. In that sense, we do not have a future, not in the way that our grandparents did. Fully imagined cultural futures are the luxury of another day, in which now was of some greater duration. Now, of course, things can change so abruptly, so violently, so profoundly, that we no longer have sufficient now to stand on. We have no future because the present is too volatile. Gibson is talking about two kinds of volatility. Conflict, that of constant fear that made just ordinary life a hell of a lot more complicated, and technology. In 2003, the internet was very much so resembling the way that it looks now. You had eBay for the better part of a decade, and you could download movies, watch movies, YouTube would come out in the next couple years, and it was the easiest way to relive the past, especially in a time so complicated, where you didn't know what was safe and what wasn't. People just wanted to return to the time where they could leave their front doors unlocked or their car keys in their vehicle. They didn't want to have to worry about civil unrest in Egypt. They just wanted to be able to live their lives. This, of course, was aided by the fact that there was a stream of constant remakes and sequels of remakes and sequels. There was no end. Even the future is later this year going to be something that is part of a nostalgia economy. But what about us, the youth, that never knew what this time was? To me, the 1970s is more so the setting of fictional films than an actual place. I don't know what it is. I only know what films like American Hustle tell me it is, or Forrest Gump, or what I know from my dad's music tastes. What I know of the 90s is only from cartoons that I watched as a kid. I feel nostalgic for those cartoons, sure, but it's an artificial kind of nostalgia. It's not real. It's for the product, not the time. It's sort of like that William S. Burroughs quote. You were not there for the beginning, you will not be there for the end. Your knowledge of what is going on can only be superficial and relative. I cannot dream to know what it was like in those time periods. I am just told that this time period is an untouchable greatness. And to be honest, I'm a little bit frustrated with it. And there are other people that are too. There is a certain kind of underground internet group that is producing music that is entirely foreign but totally at home. It takes the music of the 1980s, pop music, elevator music, takes a chorus or a line of a chorus or a single riff and tears it apart. It slows it down, chops it up, loops it, and makes it something totally eerie. You can recognize where it comes from, but you have no idea. You recognize it, but you have no idea where it comes from, or it is incredibly hard to touch. It is created mostly online by people like us, mid-20s or late teens, people who feel like we are under an inescapable blanket of not having anything that we can look forward to. Yeah, we get it, the future sucks. You want to go back to the 60s. But what's wrong with us? Why can't we have our own future? We don't know what our future is, but why can't we have something to look forward to? If anything, we need it. If we are literally the future, we need to work to make that as the best place we can. Because this past that we are dreaming about is so distilled by aging memory that it feels like the way this music sounds, it's this warped mess. I'm not comfortable with it. I don't think many people are. But what does our future look like? Hell if I know. We don't have a future, but let's make one. Thank you.